Mr. Jakub Kalensky has joined the Center's Hybrid Influence Community of Interest as a senior analyst focusing on safeguarding democratic processes. Jakub has specialized in disinformation and Russian hybrid activities since 2015, when he joined the newly created East Strategic Communication Task Force in the European Union's Democratic Service. In the team, Jakub was responsible for raising awareness about Russia's disinformation campaigns, and he and his colleagues founded the EU versus Disinformation campaign. In 2018, Jakub joined the Atlantic Council, where he worked in the Ukraine Election Task Force and in Digital Forensic Research Laboratory, where he focused on Russian disinformation and the countermeasures against it. He testified in European Parliament and in the US Congress on Russian disinformation attacks in Europe and the countermeasures against it. Before specializing in countering disinformation, Jakub worked as a journalist in the Czech Republic. Jakub, good to have you with us again, and I leave the floor to you to start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me and for inviting me here. Very good afternoon to you all. As you can see in the window, it's rather evening here in Finland. Okay, great. And here we see the presentation. As Ralph mentioned, I focus mainly on Russian disinformation and also against what can be done against it, on the countermeasures against disinformation campaigns. But in this particular presentation, we'll be talking about the 101 of Russian disinformation, what it is and what makes it a threat. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this will be briefly the content. We will talk about the definition of disinformation. Why does Russian disinformation get the most attention? What is Russia trying to achieve? What makes it a threat? To give a few examples, we will discuss the narratives targeting Ukraine very briefly. And finally, who is helping the Kremlin to achieve their goals. Next slide, please. So this is the definition of disinformation from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which was probably one of the first occurrences of the world ever. And it is false information with the intention to deceive public opinion. So the key components are false information and the intention to deceive. Perhaps the next slide will show us the distinction from other terms. Yeah, thanks. So we also have misinformation, which is unintentionally spread false information. In some articles, especially in the newspaper, you would find the term misinformation campaigns. In my opinion, that's an oxymoron. You can't have a campaign that is unintentionally spreading false information. If it's intentional, it is always disinformation. And you can also have malinformation. See, for example, the 2016 DNC hacks, where you have truthful information presented in a harmful way. Next slide, please. So why does Russia get so much attention? This is a graph from a study written by the Princeton University Trends in Online Influence Efforts, and they found that worldwide, Russia is responsible for 62% of these influence efforts. So roughly speaking, twice as much as the rest of the world combined. And in Europe, this number is even higher. In Europe, it is approximately 80% of influence efforts attributed to Russia. And next slide, please. So it is probably therefore why the European Union said that the disinformation by Russian Federation poses the greatest threat to the European Union, which is in the action plan from 2018. Unfortunately, so far, it doesn't really look like this #1 threat would receive number one reaction. Next slide, please. This is how Russia is talking about disinformation, and it was partly covered in the presentations of my two colleagues, but it is basically a non-military measure, how to achieve military goals. So you can see Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, talks about word camera information as another type of weapon, another type of armed forces. Next slide, please. And the trouble is that this is not just the official representatives of the Russian state talking this way. This is also how the pseudo-journalists understand their role. Margarita Simonian, the head of Russia Today, talks about their channel as an information weapon or as a parallel to the Ministry of Defense. Dmitry Kiselyov, who's the head of VGTRK, the main person of Russian state propaganda, when he was describing to the journalists of one Sputnik version somewhere in Central Asia, what is their role? He was saying that nowadays it is becoming increasingly expensive to kill an enemy soldier, but if you persuade them, you do not need to kill them. You really wouldn't find any other country in the world probably where they perceive journalism as a cheaper alternative to killing people. There were 300 Russian pseudo-journalists who received awards for objective coverage of what was happening in Crimea. So basically for misleading the whole world that there are no Russian soldiers there and that it is not annexation. 60 Russian pseudo-journalists received awards from the Ministry of Defense for participating in the war in Syria, not for reporting, not for their journalistic work, but for participating in the war. So even the Ministry of Defense and even the journalists see themselves as a part of rank and file of the military. Next slide, please. To understand what is Russia trying to achieve, it might be useful to remind of the difference between zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games. In the democratic West, we perceive the relationships between countries as a non-zero-sum game. So we can have a more attractive Netherlands, more attractive Belgium, and nobody is losing anything. And this is not how Russia sees it. Russia sees it as a zero-sum game. So in case Ukraine gains, Russia is losing. And what is the only game in town you have if you prove to be absolutely incompetent to improve your own position, to make your country better, make it more attractive? And this is what 20 years of Vladimir Putin's reign is showing us. He's not capable to make the country attractive. The emigration out of Russia is on the levels as it used to be during the Soviet Union. It is still, the economy is still dependent on fossil fuels. He is not capable of making Russia more attractive. Therefore, the only other game in town he has is weakening the adversary on every single level. Whatever harms him helps me. Next slide, please. So from this point of view, it is possible to understand all the Russian information efforts as an attempt to weaken the West and strengthen the Kremlin in this zero-sum game approach. And this will be happening via different messages and different channels for different audiences. The messaging you will be trying on a 20-year-old student in the capital will be different from the messaging you will be trying on a 70-year-old pensioner in the countryside. The channels will be probably different. The pensioner is likely not to be on TikTok, and the student probably will not read the chain emails, but the messaging might be quite similar, actually. To understand the mechanism, it is useful to remind this old metaphor, which you might have heard already. Ladislav Bittman, the Czechoslovak defector from the communist secret police, who was working on active measures, including disinformation, he likened the work in a disinformation factory to an evil doctor. The doctor is trying to make the most precise diagnosis of his patient. He's trying to find the biggest weaknesses, and he's trying to make them worse, not better, trying to speed him to an early grave. And the weaknesses, the illnesses will be different in any given society. The weakness that gets the most exploited in the US, which is probably the racial question, wouldn't play really well in my home country, which is Czech Republic, because it's a very homogeneous country. But in my country, it's likely the migration crisis. In some other countries, it might be LGBT questions, but every single country will have some weaknesses. Even the most resilient ones, like Finland, where I currently live, they do have some weaknesses that the disinformers will be trying to exploit. Next slide, please. So just to have a look at the key strategic narratives that currently the Kremlin is using against Ukraine in this zero-sum game approach, harming the adversary and strengthening the Kremlin. So I think we could see three strategic narratives: that the victim is the aggressor and the aggressor is the victim, that Ukraine is worthless and governed by the West, it's not even a country, and then the narrative of nuclear weapons. So let's move ahead to the next slide. The victim is the aggressor narrative. That would be all this dehumanization of Ukrainians, claims that Ukrainians are dangerous Nazis or fascists, that Ukraine leads a civil war against its own people. Russia is a poor victim of Ukraine and not the aggressor in Ukraine. Russian speakers are allegedly oppressed, which is a nonsense. I don't really speak well Ukrainian. Whenever I go to Ukraine, I usually speak Russian or English, and nobody really oppressed me for speaking Russian. Next slide, please. The second bigger strategic narrative would be about this, that the enemy is actually worthless. It doesn't even matter. Next slide, please. So that would be the narrative that Ukrainians are not even a nation. Ukraine is not a country. It is just basically a part of Russia. So who cares what's happening there? That Ukraine is a failed state, which is one of the narratives that the Russian disinformers will be trying even within Ukraine. Unlike all the other ones, this is the one that maybe might fly in Ukraine. Or that Ukraine is governed by the West, that they have no agency in what is happening in the country. Next slide, please. All this was actually in the speech already more than a year old, which was probably quite a strong indication of the preparation of the invasion. Putin's speech from July last year on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. So the claims that independent Ukraine is an anti-Russian project constructed by the West. Ukrainian state is comparable to the use of weapons of mass destruction against us. This portrayal that we as the future aggressors, we are the victims here. Or that Kiev authorities are to blame for the civil war. Next slide, please. This narrative that the enemy is both weak and strong. This is, by the way, one of the signs of fascism described by Umberto Eco in his essay, Ur-Fascism. And I think you would find a few more distinctive features between the fascist propaganda and the current Russian propaganda. Next slide, please. Up to the point that Timothy Snyder, the historian, actually talks about schizo-fascism, where actual fascists in Russia are calling their opponents fascists, which is what we see in the disinformation campaign. Next slide, please. And finally, nuclear threat. If all these dismissals and distortions do not work, then you go to the dismay, to quote Bernimo's 4D approach. So trying to threat with nuclear strikes. Next slide, please. It is something they have been doing already during the Cold War, as you could read, for example, in the book by Ladislav Bittman, the disinformer I mentioned earlier. He was describing how Russia used the threats with nuclear strike after 1956 Hungary, 1968 Czechoslovakia, 1979 Afghanistan. Every time they would threaten with nukes and hope that the West will give in to this horrible threat. But they were using this narrative also during Putin, and on the right you can see a brief list of various nuclear threats in the past years. Next slide, please. So what do all these key strategic narratives that we've just seen, what do they all have in common? Next slide, please. They justify Russia's crimes in Ukraine. So if Ukrainians are dangerous fascists, it is probably okay to kill them. And if they commit genocide, it is okay to kill them. And if the West uses Ukraine to fight Russia, it is okay to invade Ukraine. So all these narratives are there just to justify Russia's crimes and to strengthen Russia's position in the current war. Next slide, please. Who is helping to spread the message? Next slide, please. It is really much bigger than just the troll factory that you would so often read in the newspaper about. It starts from the man at the very top and the whole government around him, including all the embassies everywhere in the world. And that is already quite a big structure spreading disinformation. All the secret services are involved in the information operations. The army as well, they have a special unit just for information operations. The pseudo media, which are financed in billions of US dollars per year. And I believe that during the current war, even though Russia has economic difficulties, the spending on the pseudo media has even increased. The Gongos, government-organized NGOs like Rosotrudnichestvo or Ruski Mir are involved in disinformation operations. Various activists and researchers, witting agents and useful idiots, and all that only gets later amplified by the huge troll factory that unfortunately gets the most attention, but the ecosystem is significantly bigger. Next slide, please. It's actually look at the Russia's disinformation ecosystem from a report by the Global Engagement Center in the United States. So in case anybody would like to have a more full picture, it's in this report, Pillars of Russia's Disinformation and Propaganda Ecosystem. Next slide, please. This is a look at some of the votes in the European Parliament, how the parties are voting in Russia-related questions like annexation of Crimea, for example, or sanctions related to Russia. And you would see that the extreme left and extreme right, although they are supposedly on the extremes, when it comes to Russia, they always vote like one. And the quote from Alexander Dugin should explain how this mechanism works. Russia, including in the efforts in the information domain, they are not really looking for some positive motivations like for what you are, but they are looking for negative motivations. What are you opposing? What are you against? So are you against the EU? Are you against NATO? Are you against your government, your mainstream media? Then you will be sooner or later used by the Russian disinformation ecosystem. Next slide, please. Who can help you with this destabilization or this weakening of the West, apart from all the segments of the information ecosystem we just described, which will be more or less directly controlled by the Kremlin? Then you will have some indirectly or even not controlled parts of the ecosystem that will be helping to spread the Russian disinformation because it fits their purposes. And various researchers have observed various groups doing that, be it fight clubs, be it neo-Nazis, be it gangs or pro-gun lobbyists, traditional values activists, very often helping to spread the Russian disinformation. A lot of it was covered in the article by Michael Carpenter, Russia is co-opting angry young men. Next slide, please. And just to conclude, what can we do to counter it? I would refer to my report published approximately half a year ago. Duwan already mentioned it. Thank you very much for the kind mention of this. And this is about so-called 4 lines of defense approach. Next slide, please. So I do believe there are actually many things we could be doing, and there are many best practices in the Euro-Atlantic space what can be done against disinformation. And I think the countermeasures fall in these 4 basic lines. Firstly, documenting of the threat. There is still a lot more that we need to be doing. There's still a lot of information that we are missing. How many disinformation channels there are, how many messages they spread, how many people do they persuade. It is a little bit like fighting COVID without actually having the knowledge, how many people got the virus, how many people ended up in the hospital, and how many people died. We don't have this information and we are supposed to find the pandemic. The second line would be raising awareness about the threat. So whereas in the first line, we are trying to gather more information, in the second line, we are trying to spread it among more people. Here, the number of actors is really key. I think it's great that we are having this seminar. Also, it's very useful to bear in mind that we do not address 100% of the population. We need other actors who will be addressing those segments of the population we don't speak to. For example, the pensioners on the countryside, which probably wouldn't listen to me in the Czech Republic because I used to work in Brussels and I used to work for a US think tank, so I'm immediately suspicious. But we need to be finding those actors who will be speaking to these vulnerable groups as well. The third line of defense is repairing of the weaknesses in the information systems, or it could also be called building up resilience. And here, the social media is most often mentioned as one of the weaknesses that disinformers are exploiting. But traditional media still very often get exploited by Russian disinformers. And Kasper actually had quite a few examples of that. The way they report even about the current war in Ukraine, the alleged results of the pseudo-referenda in the southeastern regions, for example, it is very often just parroting Russian disinformation. This is a weakness that still needs to be repaired. But also the media literacy programs, this long-term game. And finally, limiting, punishing, and deterring of the information aggressors. And there is still so much more we could be doing. The EU has stepped up with some of the sanctions against disinformers since February, but mainly against individuals, not so much against the organizations. So it is still legal for many Western companies to do business with Russian disinformation organizations like Первый канал or Россия 24. Until 2021, the biggest advertisers from Russian state TV, or some of the biggest advertisers from Russian state TV, were still Western companies. So it was still Western companies paying for anti-Western propaganda. Just recently, the American Politico published a piece on how Россия сегодня, again, one Russian disinformation organization, they call themselves media, was actually still doing business in the United States and paying for media content in US media. So there's still a lot more we could be doing to actually limit the information operations, limit the aggressors behind these information operations. I will be happy to elaborate on that on the Q&A session. Let me stop here. I think I'm already too long.